17. To bear. The next week brought a return to work as the Senate came back from winter recess to convene a new year. I sat numbly at my desk, trying to lose myself in my many tasks while pretending I was completely fine. And though I was as capable as I'd ever been of keeping up with the hectic work pace, I now felt I was encased in a dark gray haze. All my fury had faded after my rage-fueled New Year's confrontation, replaced by a listless melancholy. It didn't help that it was winter, which meant short, frigid, overcast days for the most part. But even when I was inside warm and cheerful places, the colors seemed dimmer to me than I knew in the back of my head that they should. It also didn't help that all of this felt very melodramatic, even though the pain was real. I was dealing with a breakup, a betrayal, but didn't those happen every day? And often to people who had weathered relationships longer than a few months. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being a bit silly, which is why I kept everything to myself and acted as though all was fine. I reasoned that as long as I went through the motions of my routine, no one could have proof that I was as weak and sad as I felt. I was a little surprised that the rhythms of life were continuing around me, precisely as they always had, utterly unfazed by my misery. Everything just kept humming along in the political world and beyond. The first official voting of the presidential race took place in just 3 weeks in Iowa and then New Hampshire, and I could sense the mounting anticipation on the Hill. Congressman Candle had dropped out over the holidays due to insufficient funds, and a new Time CNN poll showed Bremen's leads in both states had decreased slightly, as Rexford and Wye had picked up steam. These developments generated a considerable amount of chatter, with everyone in town offering their opinion on how things would play out. I distracted myself from my hollowness by tuning in and trying to care. On the evening of a candidate's debate, I was unexpectedly summoned to RG's office, where I found him watching the screen intently. "For crying out loud, John, give a straight answer on that," he said in frustration as Senator Bremen replied to a moderator-asked question. I noticed the line between RG's right eye and ear was actually throbbing. "Doesn't he sound like he overthinks everything?" RG turned to me. "But then he gets rattled so easily. He spent his whole life preparing for this race. You'd think he'd be a little bolder." RG shook his head in exasperation. I watched as Bremen delivered a scripted zinger that I knew had been written by Aaron and felt a surge of anger. I was speaking before I even realized it. "It's a crime that Bremen's still the front runner," I spat. "I can't stand him or the people who work for him. They're all a bunch of lying bastards." RG looked surprised by my outburst, which made two of us. "Well, I'm not sure I'd go that far," he replied with a raised eyebrow. "But they could certainly be running a better campaign." I nodded with my mouth shut to thwart further eruptions. Though I regretted my vitriol, it was oddly comforting to feel something other than dull dejection. And luckily RG didn't seem all that fazed. "It's a fundamentally pompous campaign," he continued in a more peeved tone. "John acts like he deserves just be handed the nomination. It's insulting. Meanwhile, Max Y sounds like he'd cut off his own leg if it would help the American people in some way." I agreed, and I desperately wanted Y or Rexford or Conrad to orchestrate a surge and steal the nomination. Anyone besides Bremen. "Do you like Y?" I asked. "Do you want him to win?" RG didn't take his eyes from the screen. Liking someone doesn't qualify him or her to be a good president, he answered. Yeah, okay, that was a valid point. You could like a moron, but that didn't make him competent. But I think Y would do a better job, RG continued. Not because I like him more than Brayman, but because he doesn't seem to be in it entirely for his own aggrandizement. He honestly seems to care. I could be wrong about that. I certainly haven't spent enough time with him to know. But I have spent enough time with Brayman to know that he's not to be trusted. He makes cowardly decisions that are often based primarily on making himself look good. I don't think that's a good way to run this country, RG concluded. As for the others, Rexford's too inexperienced and Conrad's just not catching on. So I suppose Y is the best of the field. I wondered whether RG had regrets about not throwing his hat into the ring this time around. He certainly would have had a good shot at the nomination. I believe this even more firmly after having watched the current candidates strive and stumble in the past few months. Did RG doubt his decision? Did he wish he'd taken Brayman on? Did I have the courage to ask him? I cleared my throat. No, I wasn't brave enough. I wanted to assume he didn't have regrets, just because I like believing in the relative infallibility of his instincts. RG turned away from the TV and back to some papers on his desk. Were we done watching the debate? It seemed that I'd been summoned to his office solely for that purpose, which was flattering. And while talking with RG, my gray haze had felt thinner. I didn't want to return to my desk where it bunched in a thick cloud. I racked my brain for something interesting to say to prolong my stay. I like the way Y leans forward when he's making a point. I blurted. He looks like he might spill right out of the television, which makes him seem more accessible and a little kooky, which I also like. Good kooky, not bad kooky, I clarified. RG blinked impassively at me before resuming reading whatever was on his desk. Yep, I'd murdered the moment. Now I had to go serve my time back in my cubicle, where I had much more trouble feeling important or consulted. I could feel myself slipping quickly back into the glum funk I'd vainly attempted to escape. Oh, Samantha, RG stopped me as I trudged out the door. I almost forgot why I asked you in here. Of course, he hadn't invited me just to hang out. I was an idiot. I want to host some dinner seminars on the efforts to find cures for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and others within that family of disease, RG said, as he referred to the papers on his desk. I was reviewing the current funding, and it struck me as wildly inadequate. I'd like substantive discussions, nothing just for show, he said. Yes, sir, I replied. Could you get me an outline for the series first thing in the morning, he asked, turning back to the TV to illustrate that this wasn't really a question. I nodded to his profile and headed for the coffee machine. It was already 9 p.m. I was going to need the caffeine. Mona passed by on her way out for the night. Late night, she asked, and eyeing the 2 cups I just poured for myself. I nodded. Though Mona and I had enjoyed a newfound closeness after our New York trip, I had withdrawn from her along with everyone else in the past week. Listen, I heard about you and Aaron, she continued, and I know you probably don't want to talk about it, but I just thought you should know that it's definitely for the best. He's no good. Again, this seemed to suggest that she had some historical knowledge of Aaron. She was much too businesslike to make pronouncements on someone else's character based on anything less substantial than hard evidence. Thanks, but just out of curiosity, why do you say he's no good? I inquired. I mean, do you have any other reason to believe that? Mona looked at the ground. Oh, she definitely had something. Well, yeah, I guess I do. She sounded distinctly ashamed. My curiosity was piqued. Yes, I encouraged. Mona hesitated for a moment longer before unleashing a rush of words. I knew about Aaron's cheating. He was with my college roommate's younger sister when he met Darlene, and he dated both of them at the same time, and who knows who else before my friend's sister figured it out. And then Mark saw Aaron with Darlene in New York a few months back, when you were supposed to be dating him pretty seriously. They were making out at a bar. I think Mark tried to tell you, but you thought he was hitting on you instead. She finished, never taking her eyes from the floor. What? Oh, good gracious. That was what Mark had been getting at when he was acting all weird around me and asking if Aaron and I were exclusive. Couldn't he have been a little more straightforward? Although I guessed I had embarrassed him fairly quickly by preemptively announcing that he didn't have a chance with me. Why didn't I shut up sometimes and let people get to their point? Oh, was all I managed to say at first. I'm really sorry, Mona continued. I should have said something. Yeah, why didn't you? I asked. She'd had plenty of opportunities. I would have told her had the situation been reversed. It was unkind of her to have kept it from me. I didn't want Mark going after you again, she said softly. I was worried his crush would get re-triggered if you were available. I mean, even if it was unrequited, I thought maybe he'd just start thinking about you again and not about me anymore. Oh, dear. When Mona and I had talked in New York, she'd seemed perfectly secure in her relationship. But now I realized she'd been able to feel safe as long as I'd been wrapped up in another man. Oh, Mona, I said with a mixture of disbelief and sympathy. It's so clear that Mark's only into you, I insisted. I had seen the way that Mark looked at Mona, and I knew that his ditching her for me was an impossibility. He was in love with her. Perhaps that had initially been an obstacle to this discovery of his, but that was ancient history. Well, anyway, it was terrible of me not to tell you, Mona said regretfully. I'm sorry, and I'm really glad you're not with Aaron. I was too, and I felt like even more of a fool for having been with him in the first place. The next morning, I turned in the dinner series outline to RG and immersed myself in work to avoid thinking about anything else. I spent the day tracking down a group of British scientists who'd recently discovered a protein that could be used to protect against neurological diseases. Though the protein didn't amount to a cure for Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, and others, it did offer a way to slow their destructive progress. By the end of the week, I located the scientists and persuaded them to present their findings at the first dinner of the series. And somewhere in the midst of all the international calls, I'd fallen a little in love with their accents. Long immune to my mother's Anglophilia, I'd suddenly come down with a mild case. The scientists were coming, and RG was pleased with the series proposal, so I finished off the week feeling proud of what I'd accomplished, which was the first positive feeling I'd had in weeks. I felt a glimmer of hope. Could this mean I might finally be moving on and ready to cheer up? By the following morning, I decided to make a trip to Mr. Lee's to further encourage the healing. It occurred to me to try out another pet store, but I needed some sort of continuity in my life, given all the recent turmoil, even if it was the certainty of feeling like I was getting ripped off. We have missed you, Mr. Lee exclaimed. What do you need, a Japanese fighting fish? There are some truly beautiful ones just in. Yep, I bet there were. I just want to look around for a bit, I answered noncommittally. Of course, take your time, he replied. He busied himself behind the counter, but I felt him watching every move I made. I spent some time looking at the snakes and wondering why people ever had them as pets. I mean, fish weren't cuddly, but snakes were just ridiculous. I couldn't understand the justification for buying them, unless the people that owned them simply enjoyed watching them devour frozen mice and rats and frogs for the fun of it. After a while, wouldn't that stop being exciting? Then one was just left with an enormous bored python. That didn't seem like a good situation. I already had python issues, having read about one in Florida that had escaped from its cage and entered the city's sewer system. It had been discovered coming out of the toilet by some poor, unsuspecting woman trying to brush her teeth. I shuddered just recalling the account. What was worse, this hadn't been the first article I'd read about such an occurrence. It was around the 9th or 10th, which suggested that pythons slithering out of plumbing was a relatively common event. Accordingly, I couldn't sit on a toilet seat without looking into the bowl first. And when everything seemed in order, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was incredibly vulnerable sitting in that particular spot, considering how often I needed to use the toilet. Parentheses, not any more than the average person, but the point was it was a regular occurrence, close parentheses. I spent too much of my time stressing about pythons. I walked over and examined the Japanese fighting fish. I think I'll take that one. I pointed decisively to a medium-sized fish with an orange fleck, with whom I'd felt an immediate bond upon eye contact. Are they still $3 apiece? Mr. Lee held up his index finger and thumb in a little bit more gesture. I shrugged. The actual price of the fish, though constantly escalating in Mr. Lee's dominion, wasn't where the expenses racked up. It was the bowl and the pebbles and the food and the exotic seaweed and the little underwater castles that he convinced you that you needed. And though I already had all of those things, I found myself wondering if they were contaminated after another fish had died, and so tended to buy new, slightly varied sets. Mr. Lee held out my new charge to me in a plastic bag. Was all of this tax deductible? I had a new dependent after all. I returned to my apartment an hour later, laden with a complete set of new products for my latest pet. Liza called as I was carefully monitoring the water temperature and preparing the delicate transfer of my new guy into his palatial estate. I went with the orange pebbles this time to match his little fleck, I informed her. Plus, there's a treasure chest for him to hide in. No castle this time. I think the castle is a bit overwhelming. That's great, Liza replied, in a tone that indicated she hadn't called to hear about my fishbowl decorating ideas. She'd been very attentive since the errand showdown, but I could tell she was newly preoccupied with something, which was fine with me because getting back to our normal conversations made me feel better than anything else. What's up with you? I asked obligingly, though I really did want her input on good names for my new tenant. I was debating between Dr. Cincinnati, Clockwork, and other names I hadn't yet thought of. It was alright, there was still plenty of time before the christening, which generally happened in a ceremony a week after the purchasing of the fish. That week lag was important for the naming process because this time allowed for their personalities to come out, or in the case of Shackleton, for the power to go out, transforming his bowl into a frozen wasteland. Well, funny you should ask, Liza replied. She was now using a voice that suggested I sit down and brace myself for what she was about to reveal. I assumed it had to do with the football player she'd recently been dating. His name was Scooter, and he was the third-string running back for the Redskins. He was chiseled and sure of himself, and talked a lot about the theme restaurant he was launching with some teammates. He was apparently trying to get the Redskinettes, or Skinistas, or whatever the cheerleaders were called, to sign on as waitresses. He didn't strike me as Liza's soulmate, but I made a decision not to be critical, since I clearly needed all my energy to make sure I didn't choose a lying, cheating disaster of a boyfriend for myself. Let those who hadn't discovered their intended's betrayal via aggressive voicemail code-breaking cast the first stone. I was shutting up. "What's going on?" I asked, steeling myself for shock. "Well, you know I'm a fan of your theory about sleeping with someone as a screening process to make sure they don't have any perversions that could really be a bummer later on," she began. "Because it makes sense. You want to know what you're up against before you get too emotionally invested. But have you ever had it work? I mean, where it turns out they do? How do you gauge how serious it is and whether you should bail or not?" That particular theory had been developed after my one and only time of sleeping with someone on the first date. That one person had been Aaron, so the theory had clearly been fatally flawed from the get-go, though I hadn't known it at the time. I knew that Liza often slept with people way before I ever would, and I didn't want to point this out or seem judgmental, so I didn't feel that I could really answer her questions. "What exactly happened?" I asked instead. "He keeps a playbook," Liza explained in a tone of resignation. "He likes to sketch out the sex and go over it before we have it." Then during it, he sometimes calls penalties. "Oh, Liza." "I know," she answered. "Do you at least get to wear pads?" I asked. "This isn't funny," she scolded. "I thought it sort of was." "What sort of penalties does he call? Pass interference?" Liza ignored this. "Recently he started mentioning his video camera," she said morosely. "I'm worried he wants to tape us and review the place later." "You gotta break up with him." I stated the obvious. "I know," she replied. "I just needed to talk about it first." She sounded resolved as we got off the phone, and I had to admit I was pleased that she was going to be around more. Although I guess this probably meant I wasn't going to meet the divorced linebacker with whom she'd been planning to set me up with. I imagined I'd survive. I spent the rest of the day making the apartment as cheerful as possible and willing the fish to acclimate. I just put in the Little Mermaid soundtrack when Zelda called. "Just calling to check in. I've been a little worried about you down here," she said. I hadn't returned any of her messages since New Year's, which was very unlike me. "I'm sorry I've been so out of touch. It turns out you were right about Aaron. I should have kept my eyes open. I shouldn't have trusted him. I should have listened to you." There was a pause on Zelda's end of the line. "If you'd done that, you wouldn't have learned for yourself," she said kindly. "But I'm sorry he hurt you. I wish I could hurt him back." Could she? Was there some sort of renegade telemarketer revenge squad? I offered her Aaron's numbers just in case. She copied them down to humor me, told me to feel better, and promised to check in with me soon. In the following weeks, as the Chinese New Year approached and my mood continued to improve, I contemplated potential resolutions. I generally enjoyed making them on this alternative schedule because it allowed me extra time for research. As I watched the resolve of those who had adhered to the more conventional New Year's timetable crumble and deteriorate with every passing week, I gained a better understanding of the kind of resolutions one could realistically build to last. My studies indicated it was best to avoid fitness regimen or teaching yourself new language-based ones, as these were generally the first to collapse. Given my dismal feelings about romance, I was leaning towards making all my resolutions work-related. My only concern was the impact on Dr. Cincinnati, since by shunning amorous pursuits, I was willingly depriving him of a strong male role model. I decided to mitigate the situation by lapsing into a deep voice every once in a while as I made the rounds of my apartment. My decision to devote myself even more intensely to my job happened to coincide perfectly with RG's plans for a new bill. This new bill was intended to capitalize on the attention garnered by the dinner series, which, thanks to the British researchers and their fantastic accents, had started with a resounding success. The bill would increase funding to the National Institutes of Health, specifically for neurological disease research, because RG believed that well-timed legislative and financial support, combined with the recent scientific breakthroughs, could bring about cures for Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and Huntington's faster than many thought possible. I agreed with him, and I set about drafting the bill with a refreshingly renewed sense of energy and purpose. And towards the end of January, Liza finally convinced me to foray back into social scene. After much cajoling, she'd finally persuaded me to accompany her to Scooter's restaurant opening. She described it as the hottest party of the year, assuring me that half the city was invited, and claiming it was the perfect setting for my comeback. I tried to back out at the last minute, claiming an allergy attack, but she'd brought me Benadryl and shoved me into a cab. As we waited to check our coats in the crowded foyer, I looked around gingerly. There really were a lot of people here. It's nice that Scooter still invited you after you guys broke up, I remarked. Uh-huh, Liza said brightly. Wait a minute, I knew that. You did break up, didn't you? I asked suspiciously. Liza wouldn't look at me. Oh, Lord. I tried to, she replied, but he started crying and begging me to give him another chance, and then he swore he'd change, and, well, maybe he will. I mean, it's really just the sex stuff I have a problem with, she justified. Anyway, I should probably run say hi to him, but then I'm devoting my full attention to you. We're gonna have fun tonight. I want to see you happy again. I smiled and shook my head as she flitted off. I'll be right back, she assured me over her shoulder. As I checked our coats, Charlie Lawton walked in. I never really properly thanked him for saving me from the mutinous line at the airport newsstand by providing that crucial 75 cents. Also, for the first time, he really struck me as sort of cute. In our previous interactions, I'd either been too embarrassed or flustered or angry to really focus on this fact. And though I'd always been more of an Aquaman than a Superman kind of girl, which I suppose translated to Arthur Curry over Clark Kent, I could certainly appreciate the other aesthetic. I wasn't a superhero snob or anything. Charlie? I inquired. He looked up and smiled at me. "Hi," he said. Yes, he was definitely cute. I could see that now. Oh no, was that my neck rash starting? I willed the Benadryl to suppress any evidence of a sexual thrill. And actually, now that Charlie and I had made eye contact, all I could think about was the horrible, unfair article that he'd written about me. I shouldn't have called out to him. I couldn't be nice to him. I felt my smile disappear. "Yeah, thanks for helping me out at the airport," I said quickly. "Okay, gotta go." "Wait a second," he said in a steady voice that stopped my turn. I met his gaze despite myself. "I need to explain something to you, though I realize you might not believe me," he continued. "The article about you that had my name on it was not the article that I wrote. My editors added that part about abusing office finances. They wanted something with a mean edge. I'm sorry I couldn't prevent it. I just wanted you to know." I watched his mouth as he talked because his lips had a unique curve to them. I took in every word that came out, and I instantly believed him. There was something about his manner that seemed calmly honest, like he hoped people could see that he was telling the truth, but he wasn't going to kick and scream to make them. "Okay," I replied. "I tried to tell you before, but you wouldn't have anything to do with me. And then at the airport, I had to race to catch my plane. Anyway, do we understand each other now?" he asked, as he stuck out his hand. "Yes," I answered sheepishly, as I put my hand in his, remembering too late that it was still sticky from a double-sided tape incident that afternoon. He didn't visibly react to the stickiness, and his skin felt very warm. I didn't want him to release mine, but it became obvious that it was holding on too long. Feeling flustered, I let go and stared down at the ground. Why hadn't I returned his calls? Why hadn't I let him talk that night in Georgetown instead of just screaming at him? Or at the Capitol Lounge after the filibuster ended? All this could have cleared up long ago. I wondered if it would have changed anything. "Sorry I'm late," a voice that was not Charlie said. I looked up at a woman I'd never seen before, which meant that she definitely wasn't late to meet me. I watched Charlie slide his eyes away from my face towards hers. "Hi," he said as she stood on her tiptoes to kiss him on the lips. She looked at me inquisitively. "Samantha, this is Veronica Dodd. Veronica Samantha Joyce." Charlie made the introductions with an impassive look. I smiled hello in a strained way, which I knew made me look like portions of my face had been paralyzed, parentheses, and not in any sort of smoothing cosmetic fashion, close parentheses, and said something about needing to check my BlackBerry. I had just taken it out and was pretending to read an important message while silently hoping that Charlie and Veronica would move along when Liza reappeared. "What are you doing? No BlackBerrying allowed tonight," she scolded. "Yeah, that's what gets you in trouble, isn't it?" Veronica remarked with a sly smile. Charlie looked at her sharply, but she continued gazing at me. Was she trying to be funny? That was clearly a reference to the whole email debacle. Had she been dating Charlie during that time? Did it matter? I didn't like her. "What do you mean?" Liza asked in a challenging voice. I knew I could count on Liza to have my back. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to joke about a sensitive topic," Veronica said unconvincingly. "I work with Charlie at the Post. I'm Veronica," she said, as she stuck out her hand towards Liza. Liza replied. "And you're Charlie Lawton?" she asked. Charlie nodded as she shook her hand, looking a bit embarrassed. It was almost as though he knew Liza had hung a voodoo doll of him from her ceiling fan. I plan to fill her in on Charlie's explanation about his editors very soon. So are you working on any more ridiculously unfair articles? Liza asked. Not soon enough. Hey, no, it turns out that was sort of a misunderstanding, I interrupted, tugging on Liza's sleeve. Charlie's editors added that. He just told me. Liza gave Charlie a critical look. And you couldn't stop them, huh? She asked skeptically. I tried, Charlie said sincerely. Liza looked at him a moment longer before nodding. And what do you do? Veronica asked Liza, besides jump to assumptions and insult people. Would anyone like a drink? I asked loudly. Bubbly water, Veronica ordered, not taking her eyes off Liza. Huh. I hadn't expected to actually be taken up on the offer by her, but okay. I'll get that, Charlie said quickly. I glanced inquisitively at Liza. Was it safe to leave her alone with Veronica? Probably not for Veronica. Would you like the regular? I asked her. Liza nodded. Charlie and I made our way to the bar. Are we wimps for fleeing the fight? I asked him. Yep, he smiled. Oh, well, they could take care of themselves. And I was glad to have a little more time talking to Charlie now that he wasn't my nemesis. So what's the regular? He asked. Vanilla vodka and tonic with a splash of orange juice, I answered. Really? I've never heard of that, he replied. I know, I invented it. It's actually supposed to be vanilla vodka and a secret ingredient, but places like this never have the secret ingredient, so I substitute tonic instead, I elaborated. It's not as good, but it does the trick. What's the secret ingredient? He asked in an interested voice. I'd tell you, but I'd have to get you drunk first, I answered. Charlie smiled. So you're an inventor, he remarked. I nodded, feeling proud. I was glad to have my accomplishment be appropriately recognized. Ever since reading a biography of Benjamin Franklin in 4th grade, I had periodically attempted to invent things with minimal success. Besides the tasty drink, my only other lasting achievement had been a hand-powered fan that simultaneously squirted water to cool one off. I'd been stunned to find this exact contraption sold at baseball games in the last few years. On the one hand, I was glad that this brilliant invention was being enjoyed by the masses. On the other, I felt robbed of my millions. I knew I should have taken out a patent. We had arrived at the bar. I gave the bartender my instructions, and then Charlie ordered the bubbly water. And another one of her drink, he added. I beamed. My creation was taking off. You know, speaking of inventions, today was the 71st anniversary of the invention of the Philly cheesesteak I offered. I normally kept these facts to myself, but I all of a sudden felt like sharing. Charlie looked intrigued. Well, that calls for a celebration, then, he replied. I smiled. Not too many people understood that. Took care of that at lunch, I answered, patting my tummy. Technically, cheese wasn't added until the 1940s. I cheated a little bit and had cheese on mine, I confessed. It felt good to come clean. I won't tell anyone, Charlie assured me in a lowered voice. I'd appreciate that, I smiled at him. We collected our drinks and left a tip. Charlie turned to me before we left the safe orbit of the bar. I'm sorry if Veronica offended you earlier. She can be a bit brusque, but that's just the reporter in her. She's really extremely smart, he said. In my analysis, he started off that comment well, but really tanked at the end. It was nice to have him acknowledge that his girlfriend had been somewhat rude, but he didn't have to go and ruin the moment by praising her. I smiled tightly. No problem, I said. Not that that's any excuse, he concluded. I felt myself soften. As we made our way slowly back to Liza and Veronica, Charlie gave me a sidelong glance. Listen, I was wondering if sometime you might want to... What's wrong? My face had undoubtedly conveyed the horror I felt seize my body. I couldn't answer him. I could only stare towards the door to where Aaron and Darlene had just appeared. Seeing Aaron was bad enough and something I'd been seriously dreading. But seeing him with Darlene, that wasn't supposed to be happening. We'd dumped him together, hadn't we? I watched as Aaron helped Darlene out of her stylish little coat. He leaned down to kiss her tenderly on the neck. She smiled at him and held her hand against his cheek. They hadn't seen me yet. They were too busy gazing lovingly into each other's eyes. I felt stunned and sickened and utterly immobile. Oh gosh, what if they looked up and I was just gaping at them? Why couldn't I move? My stomach turned over. I felt Charlie's hand on my elbow. Right this way, he said softly, as he guided me in the other direction, back towards our corner and out of sight. Are you alright? He asked gently. Aaron and Darlene had gotten back together? No. I felt myself shaking my head. Samantha? I stopped shaking my head and let Charlie's eyes come into focus. He looked concerned. Oh, yeah, I'm fine, I'm great, I said too loudly, as I sucked down my drink, placed it on the table, and started in on Liza's. I needed to get a hold of myself, and I needed to get out of there. Oh, are you sure you're okay? Even when Charlie was being kind, as he certainly was now, he managed to have a sort of detached, observant way about him. I found myself both implicitly trusting him and fearing his judgment. He definitely seemed to be studying me. I'm sorry, I can't imagine what you think of me, I said, letting waves of self-consciousness wash over me. I felt like bursting into tears. Charlie put his hand on my shoulder. I just think you're a little confused, he replied. I felt taken aback. I hadn't expected him to answer. It had been rhetorical insecurity, better left floating out there. But now I had confirmation of my fears that he was judging me, on top of the shock of seeing Aaron with Darlene. Where did Charlie think he was? I didn't need to be talked down to. Oh, really? I said archly. I was about to say more about how I thought he was a little condescending, and maybe a little confused himself, to be dating a shrew like Veronica, but Liza suddenly appeared. Hey, wow, did you see the time? She said in a very officious voice. We've really gotta go. Bye, guys. She turned to wave at Veronica and nodded to Charlie as she led me away. I didn't even bother waving. Liza steered me towards the side of the restaurant, looking straight ahead. I knew what she was trying to do. I've already seen them, I informed her. Oh, crap, she replied. I was hoping to get you out of here quickly and bizarrely, under false pretenses, and then break the news gently. This chapter is really long, so I'm going to pause it on the end of page 289 and pick up again on page 290.